The nuclear arms race was a competition for supremacy in nuclear warfare between the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies during the Cold War. During this period, in addition to the American and Soviet nuclear stockpiles, other countries developed nuclear weapons, though none engaged in warhead production on nearly the same scale as the two superpowers. World War II. The first nuclear weapon was created by the U.S. during the Second World War and was developed to be used against the Axis powers. Scientists of the Soviet Union were aware of the potential of nuclear weapons and had also been conducting research on the field. The Soviet Union was not informed officially of the Manhattan Project until Stalin was briefed at the Potsdam Conference on July 24, 1945, by U.S. President Harry S. Truman, 8 days after the first successful test of a nuclear weapon. Despite their wartime military alliance, the United States and Britain had not trusted the Soviets enough to keep knowledge of the Manhattan Project safe from German spies. There were also concerns that, as an ally, the Soviet Union would request and expect to receive technical details of the new weapon. When President Truman informed Stalin of the weapons, he was surprised at how calmly Stalin reacted to the news and thought that Stalin had not understood what he had been told. Other members of the United States and British delegations who closely observed the exchange formed the same conclusion. In fact, Stalin had long been aware of the program, despite the Manhattan Project having a secret classification so high that, even as vice president, Truman did not know about it or the development of the weapons. A ring of spies operating within the Manhattan Project had kept Stalin well informed of American progress. They provided the Soviets with detailed designs of the implosion bomb and the hydrogen bomb. Fuchs' arrest in 1950 led to the arrests of many other Russian spies, including Harry Gold, David Greenglass, and Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. In August 1945, on Truman's orders, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japanese cities. The first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki by the B-29 bombers named Enola Gay and Boxcar respectively. Shortly after the end of the Second World War in 1945, the United Nations was founded. During the United Nations First General Assembly in London in January 1946, they discussed the future of nuclear weapons and created the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission. The goal of this assembly was to eliminate the use of all nuclear weapons. The United States presented their solution, which was called the Baroque Plan. This plan proposed that there should be an international authority that controls all dangerous atomic activities. The Soviet Union disagreed with this proposal and rejected it. The Soviets' proposal involved universal nuclear disarmament. Both the American and Soviet proposals were refused by the UN. Early Cold War. In the years immediately after the Second World War, the United States had a monopoly on specific knowledge of and raw materials for nuclear weaponry. Initially, it was thought that uranium was rare in the world, but this turned out to be wrong. American leaders hoped that their exclusive ownership of nuclear weapons would be enough to draw concessions from the Soviet Union, but this proved ineffective. Just 6 months after the UN General Assembly, the United States conducted its first post-war nuclear tests. This was called Operation Crossroads. The purpose of this operation was to test the effectiveness of nuclear explosions on ships. These tests were performed at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific on 95 ships, including German and Japanese ships that were captured during World War II. One plutonium implosion-type bomb was detonated over the fleet, while the other one was detonated underwater. Behind the scenes, the Soviet government was working on building its own atomic weapons. During the war, Soviet efforts had been limited by a lack of uranium, but new supplies in Eastern Europe were found and provided a steady supply while the Soviets developed a domestic source. While American experts had predicted that the Soviet Union would not have nuclear weapons until the mid-1950s, the first Soviet bomb was detonated on August 29, 1949, shocking the entire world. The bomb, named First Lightning by the West, was more or less a copy of Fat Man, one of the bombs the United States had dropped on Japan in 1945. Both governments spent massive amounts to increase the quality and quantity of their nuclear arsenals. Both nations quickly began the development of a hydrogen bomb, and the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb on November 1, 1952, on âWorld, an atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Codenamed IV Mike, the project was led by Edward Teller, a Hungarian-American nuclear physicist. It created a cloud 100 miles wide and 25 miles high, killing all life on the surrounding islands. Again, the Soviets surprised the world by exploding a deployable thermonuclear device in August 1953, although it was not a true multi-stage hydrogen bomb. However, it was small enough to be dropped from an airplane, making it ready for use. The development of these two Soviet bombs was greatly aided by the Russian spies Harry Gold and Klaus Fuchs. On March 1, 1954, the U.S. conducted the Castle Bravo test, which tested another hydrogen bomb on Bikini Atoll. Scientists significantly underestimated the size of the bomb, thinking it would yield 5 megatons. However, it yielded 14.8 megatons, which is the largest nuclear explosion tested by the U.S. The explosion was so large the nuclear fallout exposed residents up to 300 miles away to significant amounts of radiation. They were eventually evacuated, but most of them experienced radiation poisoning and resulted in one death from a crew member of a fishing boat 90 miles from the explosion. The Soviet Union detonated its first true hydrogen bomb on November 22, 1955, which had a yield of 1.6 megatons. On October 23, 1961, the Soviets detonated a hydrogen bomb with a yield of approximately 58 megatons. The most important development in terms of delivery in the 1950s was the introduction of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Missiles had long been regarded the ideal platform for nuclear weapons, and were potentially a more effective delivery system than strategic bombers, which was the primary delivery method at the beginning of the Cold War. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union showed the world that they had missiles able to reach any part of the world when they launched the Sputnik satellite into Earth orbit. The United States launched its first satellite Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958. The space race showcased technology critical to the delivery of nuclear weapons, the ICBM boosters, while maintaining the appearance of being for science and exploration. Mutual assured destruction. None of these defensive measures were secure, and in the 1950s both the United States and Soviet Union had enough nuclear power to obliterate the other side. Both sides developed a capability to launch a devastating attack even after sustaining a full assault from the other side, called a second strike. This policy was part of what became known as mutual assured destruction. Both sides knew that any attack upon the other would be devastating to themselves, thus in theory restraining them from attacking the other. Both Soviet and American experts hoped to use nuclear weapons for extracting concessions from the other, or from other powers such as China, but the risk connected with using these weapons was so grave that they refrained from what John Foster Dulles referred to as brinkmanship. While some, like General Douglas MacArthur, argued nuclear weapons should be used during the Korean War, both Truman and Eisenhower opposed the idea. Both sides were unaware of the capacity of the enemy's arsenal of nuclear weapons. The Americans suffered from a lack of confidence, and in the 1950s they believed in a non-existing bomber gap. Aerial photography later revealed that the Soviets had been playing a sort of Potemkin village game with their bombers in their military parades, flying them in large circles, making it appear they had far more than they truly did. The 1960 American presidential election saw accusations of a wholly spurious missile gap between the Soviets and the Americans. On the contrary, the Soviet government exaggerated the power of Soviet weapons to the leadership and Nikita Khrushchev. An additional controversy formed in the United States during the early 1960s concerned whether or not it was certain if their weapons would work if the need should occur. All of the individual components of nuclear missiles had been tested separately, but it had been infeasible to test them all combined. Critics charged that it was not really known how a warhead would react to the gravity forces and temperature differences encountered in the upper atmosphere and outer space, and Kennedy was unwilling to run a test of an ICBM with a live warhead. The closest thing to an actual test was 1962's Operation Frigatebird, in which the submarine USS Ethan Allen launched a Polaris A-2 missile over 1,000 miles to the nuclear test site at Christmas Island. It was challenged by, among others, Curtis LeMay, who put missile accuracy into doubt to encourage the development of new bombers. Other critics pointed out that it was a single test which could be an anomaly, that it was a lower altitude SLBM and therefore was subject to different conditions than an ICBM, and that significant modifications had been made to its warhead before testing. Initial nuclear proliferation. In addition to the United States and the Soviet Union, 3 other nations, the United Kingdom, People's Republic of China, and France also developed far smaller nuclear stockpiles. In 1952, the United Kingdom became the 3rd nation to possess nuclear weapons when it detonated an atomic bomb in Operation Hurricane on October 3, 1952, which had a yield of 25 kilotons. Despite major contributions to the Manhattan Project by both Canadian and British governments, the U.S. Congress passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which prohibited multinational cooperation on nuclear projects. The McMahon Act fueled resentment from British scientists and Winston Churchill, as they believed that there were agreements regarding post-war sharing of nuclear technology, and led to Britain developing its own nuclear weapons. Britain did not begin planning the development of their own nuclear weapon until January 1947. Because of Britannia unregistered trademark S small size, they decided to test their bomb on the Montebello Islands, off the coast of Australia. Following this successful test, under the leadership of Churchill, Britain decided to develop and test a hydrogen bomb. The first successful hydrogen bomb test occurred on November 8, 1957, which had a yield of 1.8 megatons. An amendment to the Atomic Energy Act in 1958 allowed nuclear cooperation once again, and British-US nuclear programs resumed. During the Cold War, British nuclear deterrence came from submarines and nuclear-armed aircraft. The Resolution-class ballistic missile submarines armed with the American-built Polaris missile provided the sea deterrent, while aircraft such as the Avro Vulcan, Sepekhat Jaguar, Panavia Tornado and several other Royal Air Force strike aircraft carrying WE-177 gravity bomb provided the air deterrent. France became the 4th nation to possess nuclear weapons on February 13, 1960, when the atomic bomb Bois Bleu was detonated in Algeria, then still a French colony, formerly a part of the metropolitan France. France began making plans for a nuclear weapons program shortly after the Second World War, but the program did not actually begin until the late 1950s. 8 years later, France conducted its first thermonuclear test above Fanjajifar Atoll. It had a yield of 2.6 megatons. This bomb significantly contaminated the atoll with radiation for 6 years, making it off-limits to humans. During the Cold War, the French nuclear deterrent was centered around the Force de Frappe, a nuclear triad consisting of Dassault Mirage 4 bombers carrying such nuclear weapons as the AN-22 gravity bomb and the ASMP standoff attack missile, Pluton and Hades ballistic missiles, and the Redoutable class submarine armed with strategic nuclear missiles. The People's Republic of China became the 5th nuclear power on October 16, 1964 when it detonated a 25-kiloton uranium-235 bomb in a test codenamed 596 at Lopnur. In the late 1950s, China began developing nuclear weapons with substantial Soviet assistance in exchange for uranium ore. However, the Sino-Soviet ideological split in the late 1950s developed problems between China and the Soviet Union. This caused the Soviets to cease helping China develop nuclear weapons. However, China continued developing nuclear weapons without Soviet support and made remarkable progress in the 1960s. Due to Soviet-Chinese tensions, the Chinese might have used nuclear weapons against either the United States or the Soviet Union in the event of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Chinese nuclear deterrent consisted of gravity bombs carried aboard H-6 bomber aircraft, missile systems such as the DF-2, DF-3, and DF-4, and in the later stages of the Cold War, the Type 092 ballistic missile submarine. On June 14, 1967, China detonated its first hydrogen bomb. Cuban Missile Crisis. Shortly after Fulgencio Batista had control of the Cuban government and became dictator, revolutionaries started to emerge to challenge Batista. However, it wasn't until December 2, 1956, when Fidel Castro landed on Cuba aboard the Granma that the resistance blossomed into an armed revolt. The Soviet Union supported and praised Castro and his resistance. On January 1, 1959, the Cuban government fell, propelling Castro into power, and was recognized by the Soviet government on January 10. When the United States began boycotting Cuban sugar, the Soviet Union began purchasing large quantities to support the Cuban economy in return for fuel and eventually placing nuclear ballistic missiles on Cuban soil. These missiles would be capable of reaching the United States very quickly. On October 14, 1962, an American spy plane discovered these nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. President Kennedy immediately called a series of meetings for a small group of senior officials to debate the crisis. The group was split between a militaristic solution and a diplomatic one. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba and all military forces to DEFCON-3. As tensions increased, Kennedy eventually ordered U.S. military forces to DEFCON-2. This was the closest the world has been to a nuclear war. While the U.S. military had been ordered to DEFCON-2, reaching a nuclear war was still a ways off. The theory of mutually assured destruction seems to put the entry into nuclear war an unlikely possibility. While the public perceived the Cuban Missile Crisis as a time of near-mass destruction, the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union were working behind the sight of the public eye in order to come to a peaceful conclusion. Premier Khrushchev writes to President Kennedy in a telegram on October 26, 1962 saying that, consequently, if there is no intention to tighten that knot and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. It is apparently clear that both men want to avoid nuclear war due to mutually assured destruction, which leads to the question of just how close the world was from experiencing a nuclear war. Eventually, on October 28, through much discussion between U.S. and Soviet officials, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would withdraw all missiles from Cuba. Shortly after, the U.S. withdrew all their nuclear missiles from Turkey in secret, which had threatened the Soviets. The U.S.'s withdrawal of their Jupiter missiles from Turkey was kept private for decades after, causing the negotiations between the two nations to appear to the world as a major U.S. victory. This ultimately led to the downfall of Premier Khrushchev. Copyright Tent. Economic problems caused by the arms race in both powers, combined with China's new role in the ability to verify disarmament, led to a number of arms control agreements beginning in the 1970s. This period, known as Copyright Tent, allowed both states to reduce their spending on weapons systems. SALT I and SALT II limited the size of the states' arsenals. Bans on nuclear testing, anti-ballistic missile systems, and weapons in space all attempted to limit the expansion of the arms race through the Partial Test Ban Treaty. In 1958, both the US and Soviet Union agreed to informally suspend nuclear testing. However, this agreement was ended when the Soviets resumed testing in 1961, followed by a series of nuclear tests conducted by the US. These events led to much political fallout, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Something had to be done to ease the great tensions between these two countries, so on October 10, 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed. This was an agreement between the US, Soviet Union, and the UK, which significantly restricted nuclear testing. All atmospheric, underwater, and outer space nuclear testing were agreed to be halted, but countries were still allowed to test underground. An additional 113 countries have signed this treaty since 1963. In November 1969, strategic arms limitation talks begun. This was primarily due to the economic impact that nuclear testing and production had on both US and Soviet economies. The SALT I Treaty, which was signed in May 1972, produced an agreement on two significant documents. These were the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Interim Agreement on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. The ABM Treaty limited each country to 2 ABM sites, while the Interim Agreement froze each country's number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles at current levels for 5 years. This treaty significantly reduced nuclear-related costs as well as the risk of nuclear war. However, SALT I failed to address how many nuclear warheads could be placed on one missile. A new technology, known as Multiple Independently Targetable Re-entry Vehicle, allowed single missiles to hold and launch multiple nuclear missiles at targets while in mid-air. Over the next 10 years, the Soviet Union and US added 12,000 nuclear warheads to their already built arsenals. Throughout the 1970s, both the Soviet Union and United States replaced old missiles and warheads with newer, more powerful and effective ones. This continued to worsen Soviet-US relations. On June 18, 1979, the SALT II Treaty was signed in Vienna. This treaty limited both sides' nuclear arsenals and technology. However, this treaty as well as the era of the Dark Copyright tent ended with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in January, 1980. The United States once again significantly increased military and nuclear spending, while the Soviets were unable to respond and continued to pursue the Dark Copyright tent. These treaties were only partially successful. Both states continued building massive numbers of nuclear weapons and researched more effective technology. Both superpowers retained the ability to destroy each other many times over. Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative. Towards the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency, and continued strongly through the subsequent presidency of Ronald Reagan, the United States rejected disarmament and tried to restart the arms race through the production of new weapons and anti-weapons systems. The central part of this strategy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based anti-ballistic missile system derided as Star Wars by its critics. However, the SDI would require technology that had not yet been developed, or even researched. This system would require both space and Earth-based laser battle stations. It would also need sensors on the ground, in the air, and in space with radar, optical, and infrared technology to detect incoming missiles. During the second part of the 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnating and unable to match American arms spending. The Soviets feared the SDI because the US would have an edge if it ever came to nuclear war. Numerous negotiations by Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to come to agreements on reducing nuclear stockpiles, but the most radical were rejected by Reagan as they would also prohibit his SDI program. However, due to enormous costs and far too complex technology for its time, the project and research was cancelled. The end of the Cold War. During the mid-1980s, the US-Soviet relations significantly improved. Mikhail Gorbachev assumed control of the Soviet Union after the deaths of several former Soviet leaders, and announced a new era of perestroika and glasnost, meaning restructuring and openness respectively. Gorbachev proposed a 50% reduction of nuclear weapons for both the US and Soviet Union at the meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland in October 1986. However, the proposal was refused due to disagreements over Reagan's SDI. Instead, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed on December 8, 1987 in Washington, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. Due to the dramatic economic and social changes occurring within the Soviet Union, many of its constituent republics began to declare their independence. With the wave of revolutions sweeping across Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was unable to impose its will on its satellite states and so its sphere of influence slowly diminished. By December 16, 1991, all of the republics had declared independence from the Union. The Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, resigned as the country's president on December 25 and the Soviet Union was declared non-existent the following day. Post-Euro-Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, the United States, and especially Russia, cut down on nuclear weapons spending. Fewer new systems were developed and both arsenals have shrunk. But both countries still maintain stocks of nuclear missiles numbering in the thousands. In the USA, Stockpile stewardship programs have taken over the role of maintaining the aging arsenal. After the Cold War ended, a large amount of resources and money which was once spent on developing nuclear weapons in Soviet Union was then spent on repairing the environmental damage produced by the nuclear arms race, and almost all former production sites are now major cleanup sites. In the USA, the plutonium production facility at Hanford, Washington and the plutonium pit fabrication facility at Rocky Flats, Colorado are among the most polluted sites. United States policy and strategy regarding nuclear proliferation was outlined in 1995 in the document Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. Despite efforts made in cleaning up uranium sites, significant problems stemming from the legacy of uranium development still exist today on the Navajo Nation in the states of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. Hundreds of abandoned mines have not been cleaned up and present environmental and health risks in many Navajo communities. India and Pakistan. In South Asia, India and Pakistan have also engaged in a technological nuclear arms race since the 1970s. The nuclear competition started in 1974 with India detonating the device, codenamed Smiling Buddha, at the Pokhran region of the Rajasthan state. The Indian government termed this test as a peaceful nuclear explosion, but according to independent sources, it was actually part of an accelerated covert nuclear program of India. This test generated great concern and doubts in Pakistan, with fear it would be at the mercy of its longer Eurotime arch-rival. Pakistan had its own covert atomic bomb projects in 1972 which extended over many years since the first Indian weapon was detonated. After the 1974 test, Pakistan's atomic bomb program picked up a great speed and accelerated its atomic project to successfully build its own atomic weapons program. In the last few decades of the 20th century, India and Pakistan began to develop nuclear-capable rockets and nuclear military technologies. Finally, in 1998 India, under Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, test detonated 5 more nuclear weapons. While the international response to the detonation was muted, domestic pressure within Pakistan began to build steam and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif ordered the test, detonated 6 nuclear war weapons in a tit-for-tat fashion and to act as a deterrent. Defense against nuclear attacks. From the beginning of the Cold War, the United States, Russia, and other nations have all attempted to develop anti-ballistic missiles. The United States developed the LIM-49 use in the 1950s in order to destroy incoming ICBMs. Russia has too, developed ABM missiles in the form of the A-35 anti-ballistic missile system and the later A-135 anti-ballistic missile system. China's state media has also announced to have tested anti-ballistic missiles, though specific information is not public. India has successfully developed its ballistic missile shield in the program Indian Ballistic Missile Defense Program with the test fire of Prithvi Air Defense, PAD, and it has also developed a cruise missile defense Akash Air Defense, AAD, to intercept low-flying missiles making India one of the 5 countries with missile shield. Arguments against calling Cold War armament an arms race. One of the chief American strategists of the Cold War era, Herman Kahn, noted that calling the bilateral armament of the Soviet Union and the United States after the 1960s an arms race is incorrect. See also, Nuclear Warfare, Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence, Deterrence Theory, Nuclear Disarmament, Nuclear Free Zone, Space Race, TNT Equivalent, Brinkmanship. References. Boughton, G. J. Journal of Inter-American Studies and World Affairs. Miami, United States of America, Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Miami. Brown, A. Reform, Coup and Collapse, The End of the Soviet State. BBC History. Retrieved November 22, 2012, Cold War, A Brief History Atomic Archive. Retrieved November 16, 2012, Doty, P., Can't Sale, A., and Nacht, M. The Race to Control Nuclear Arms. Jones, R. W. Pakistan's Nuclear Posture, Arms Race Instabilities in South Asia. Joyce, A., Bates Grabber, R., Hoffman, T. J., Paul Shaw, R., and Wong, Why the Nuclear Arms Race, An Evolutionary Perspective. Maloney, S.M. Learning to Love the Bomb, Canada's Nuclear Weapons During the Cold War. Washington, D.C., Potomac Books. May, E.R. John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. BBC History. Retrieved November 22, 2012, Van, C.M. Nuclear Proliferation and the Future of Conflict. New York, United States, Free Press. Further reading, Presidency in the Nuclear Age, Conference and Forum at the JFK Library, Boston, October 12, 2009. 4 panels, The Race to Build the Bomb and the Decision to Use It, Cuban Missile Crisis and the First Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, The Cold War and the Nuclear Arms Race, and Nuclear Weapons, Terrorism, and the Presidency. External links, Eric Ringmer, The Recognition Game, Soviet Russia Against the West, Cooperation and Conflict, 37-2, 2002 pages 115-36. The arms race between the superpowers explained through the concept of recognition. Annotated bibliography on the nuclear arms race from the ALSO's Digital Library for Nuclear Issues.